Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Assalamu alaikum everyone, and thank you for being here on a Sunday evening, on a cold Sunday evening. As many of you know, I'm Professor Said Khan at Wayne State University, and I suppose a lot of you are also following the news coming out of the Middle East with what is going on in Syria. It is a fluid situation, to say the least. And even as of this afternoon, I was trying to update the information to provide you, inshallah, as recent as I could. Last night, I actually recorded an interview that I think, inshallah, is airing at 10 p.m. today on Fox 2 News about Syria. So that provided a little bit of opportunity to also get the background information for this. But I was told be on call in case there was some new development to go ahead and do it. Luckily, there really wasn't anything today that they wanted to update on the news item. But as you know, it is a complex situation. I think for many of you, it probably also caught you by surprise. I think that is the general consensus for a lot of people, that this seemingly came out of the blue. Sometimes when things happen that quickly, it of course also leads to a lot of conspiracy theories to say that there were certain people that were involved and that the hidden hands of various forces led to this. As they say, wallahu alam, I mean, there's no way that we would necessarily know all of the intricacies and the details and those actors that would have necessarily played a role. But inshallah, what we'll do this evening is at least try to unpack what were the circumstances that brought us to this point, who are the various actors that are involved, and maybe also plotting a course to see what may happen in the future. So like in any situation, when we're looking at a historical moment as this is, there's a certain amount of historical background that we need to go ahead and provide. And if we're going to do that for Syria in 2024, we probably need to go back at least about 150 years in order to understand all of the different dynamics. So this is a modern and recent map of Syria, certainly something that has changed over many centuries, especially more recently when it came to the colonial project that was there. So I want to actually start here about 100 years ago, when World War I ended and Syria, which had at one point been part of the Ottoman Empire, was now removed from the Ottoman Empire as that empire was divided by the British and the French. Both of those countries had certain strategic interests in the region. For the British, they had discovered oil in Iraq, both in the north of Iraq near Mosul, as well as in the south in Basra. And the other major strategic interest that they had in the region was the Suez Canal in Egypt. And so in many ways, if you want to consider what was the importance of this part of the Middle East, you can talk about three rivers: the Tigris and the Euphrates, which ran through Iraq, and the Nile, which ran through Egypt, and everything in between was something that the British had a design on. At the same time, the French had been interfering, if you will, in Syria for at least 60 years before then, going back to the middle of the 19th century. One of the major strategic interests that the French had was to prop up the Arab Christian population on the coastal region of the Syrian province, the area that you know today as being Lebanon, or the Levant. And so what ended up happening was that was a recognition that the British also had, that during World War I, the French were, of course, having to suffer the most when it came to the war in Europe, or Western Europe, being fought on French soil. The French were going to want to seek some kind of compensation. The British were willing to give that to them, just not out of their own empire, but promised to do so out of anything that they gained with the defeat of the Ottoman Empire. At the same time, what they were also concerned about, the British, was that the French stay away from their major strategic assets, which was the oil in Iraq, and then also the Suez Canal, which, as some of you know, the French had actually constructed themselves, but when Egypt could no longer afford to pay back the debt, they sold it to the British in 1875. Well, fast forward to World War I, and during the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, the British and the French decided to divide up the Middle East. The French area was going to be in the northern part of the Syrian province, which included what today is Syria and Lebanon, and the area to the south of that, including Iraq, Jordan, Palestine, and Egypt, would be within British control. That would then explain the very strange lines and the boundaries, especially between Syria, Iraq, and Jordan. Well, when the war ends and the French come in and form a mandate after the League of Nations authorizes that, of which the two most powerful countries were the British and the French decide to rule Syria and Lebanon as a single unit out of Damascus. That's where their headquarters was for the French leadership. But they carved out Lebanon separately because that was an area, an enclave for the Arab Christian population to have a majority. Within Syria itself, they divide up the territory into 4 regions. In the south, you see what's known as the state of Jabal Druze, which was the stronghold of the Druze community. In the west, you see the Alawite country near Latakia on the border of the Mediterranean. And then the major part of Syria is divided into 2 major provinces, one around the city of Damascus and the other around the city of Aleppo. Now, it's important to understand this geography also because here we have the precursor to how the al-Assad family comes into power in the 1970s. The majority of Syria was Sunni, especially Damascus and Aleppo provinces. The Druze community in the south was pretty much a frontier community. Think of the Wild West in the United States, or rural areas today, for example, Wyoming and Oklahoma and places like that, and they pretty much stayed to themselves. The Sunni areas were dominated, of course, by Sunni community members, and these were, of course, the areas that also had the largest cities in Syria. So Aleppo being the largest, Damascus, Homs, Hama. And these were cities where the Sunnis dominated all of the major sectors of the industry and also the economy. So your doctors, your lawyers, your accountants, your bankers, those who were industrialists, all of these happened to be dominated by Sunnis. Well, there was one more minority community, which was, of course, the Alawi population, which was a minority sect of Shiism. And they were really concentrated in the western part of Syria here in what's known as the Alawite country. Now, the way that the French ran Syria was really, as was typical of the colonial powers, divide and rule, going ahead and keeping various groups marginalized. Now, when it came to Syrian society, as I said before, the industry and the economy was dominated by Sunnis. There really were very few sectors, for example, the Alawite community, to find any inroads. As a result, the only one that was really available was the military. And the military was a sector of Syrian society that actually Sunni families would discourage their kids to then join, for 2 reasons. Number one, they felt that if you were joining the military, you were essentially facilitating the French. You were doing their bidding, and that was something that was then against the national interests of Syria. It was only suiting the interests of the European colonial power. And the other reason why they said it was discouraged to go into the military is because Sunni kids could go into the family businesses. They had the connections, they already had the infrastructure, so there was really no incentive for them to go into the military. On contrast, for the Alawis, that was one of the few areas where they could go, they could have prestige, they had the uniforms, they had some status. And so here we find then, nearly 100 years ago, that the Alawis make their way into the military, and as a result of it, that becomes a dominant area for the Alawis to gain power. Now, 100 years ago, this would seemingly mean nothing. There was no real evidence of, for example, of the prospect of independence from the French mandate. There was no deadline that the French had gone ahead and established. But after World War II, when Syria does gain its independence, and particularly from 1949 on, we find that Syria becomes an area of political chaos. There are military overthrows after military overthrows. In the 1960s, you find the development of what is known as the Ba'ath Party. Now, in the 1960s, the entire Arab world was dominated by a very secular Arab nationalistic outlook. For example, you had Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was in power in Egypt from 1952 when the Free Officers' coup overthrows the king, overthrows the parliament of the Wafd Party, and overthrows the British rule that had been there since 1882. Nasser comes into power and essentially then sets a model for the rest of the Middle East. After Nasser's success in pushing back on Israel, Britain, and France during the Suez Crisis of 1956, Nasser becomes the hero of the Arab people. And we find then that there are not only many who want to be like Nasser, but many who will be willing to accept Nasser as their champion as well. In fact, there was a time from 1958 to 1961 that Syria and Egypt had formed a partnership and even a new country called the Syrian Arab Republic. And in that there was a sort of partnership where there was a shared currency and all, but it was a very, very uneven partnership. It was something that was dominated by Egypt and by Nasser. Well, fast forward into the 1960s, a secular party then forms in Syria, as it does also in Iraq, and this is the Ba'ath Party. Socialists, some would even claim to be somewhat fascistic in its nature, dominated by especially a very military outlook. Martial law was something that was very popular. Well, in Syria, the Ba'ath Party then emerges from members of the military. And during the 1960s, with the volatility, things finally stabilized by 1971, when a former Air Force lieutenant by the name of Hafez Al-Assad is able to then take over. And when he does, he then brings the Ba'ath Party into its full glory in Syria. Around the same time as in Iraq, you have people like Abu Bakr Siddiqui and also his protege Saddam Hussein coming to power over there. Well, what ends up happening is if there is a military dominance to the Syrian government now, and if the military was dominated by members of the Alawite community, like Hafez al-Assad, then it's no surprise that his entire power structure is going to be Alawis as well. So this then begins the process by which the Alawis, as a very small minority, start to rule a majority Sunni population in Syria. Now, Hafez al-Assad is in power until his death of a heart attack in the year 2000, and he is then succeeded by his son Bashar al-Assad. But before his death, and if you take a look at what was his particular reign, we find that his level of hostility toward particularly Sunni Muslims was very great. Now, Arab secular nationalism pretty much, at least predominantly, dies when Nasser dies in 1970, and then you have a real rivalry among others in the Arab world to sort of be the successor to Nasser. And Hafez al-Assad really tried to go ahead and leverage that. The problem, though, was that he had a lot of opposition, and of course most of his opposition happened to come from the majority community, and the majority community happened to be Sunni. One of the ways that Hafez al-Assad was able to leverage very strongly his mandate to rule with power and violence was to claim that the Muslim Brotherhood, or the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, was very strong in Syria. And in 1982, he orders a clampdown of where he claimed you had these Ikhwan strongholds, the cities of Hom and the city of Hama. And in 1982, particularly when it comes to Hama, he brings in a full force clampdown. And the estimates have never really been proven. They go all the way from about, in the very low numbers of 10,000, all the way to about 60,000. But most independent analysts place the number of killed in Hama at about 25 to 40,000. I mean, it is a real brutal clampdown that he has. Here is a scene of the streets of Hama. And this then remains in the collective memory, of course, of the Syrians, particularly the Sunni community, and it then gets, of course, reified by Bashar al-Assad himself. Now, Bashar al-Assad is an interesting individual. He had no aspirations to follow in his father's footsteps initially. In fact, he was a British-trained ophthalmologist, but he decided to come back home and join the family business after his father had died. And in many ways, what we find then is with Bashar al-Assad, he is maintaining the same structure that his father had. Not only because those in order to keep him in power are also Alawites, like were his father's supporters, but also his tactics and his methods of staying in power, the use of torture, the use of mass imprisonment of individuals. So I think it's very important then to understand how the Assad family comes to power and from where they are drawing most of their support, which is really the Alawi population, and a kind of fear that they then place in the rest of the population that the Sunnis somehow or the other are going to go ahead and cause trouble for minority communities. Therefore, it is in the best interest for them to align with the Alawis. That means if you are Syrian Christian or some other sect other than being Sunni. Well, everything then changes during the Arab Spring. As you know, the Arab Spring begins in December of 2010 with Mohammed al-Bouazizi, who is a vegetable vendor in Tunisia, who is abused by a police officer for not having the correct permit to sell vegetables off his cart. He's humiliated, and as a result of it, he decides to light himself on fire. When he does that, he creates a national movement around him. Even the president of Tunisia, Zain Abidine Ben Ali, visits him in the hospital, but Bouazizi dies 3 weeks later from severe burns. Bouazizi is removed from power within 3 weeks after serving as the second dictator of Tunisia since independence after Habib Bourguiba, but after a 30-year rule. We know then that the revolution of the Arab Spring moves to Egypt at Tahrir Square, and Hosni Mubarak is removed from power after serving himself for 30 years within a matter of 3 weeks. In February of 2011, barely 2 weeks after the Tahrir Square incident in Egypt, we find a schoolboy in the city of Daraa, down in southern Syria, writes graffiti against the regime on the wall. And it was actually a very simple message that he says. He says, freedom, your next doctor, meaning Dr. al-Assad. And so this then launches a clampdown by Bashar al-Assad, which leads to what then becomes the Syrian civil war, which rages on for quite a while. So now it's important to go ahead and decide and to determine who's on the side of the opposition for the Arab Spring in Syria. And you have really three major forces that are there. You have the Free Syrian Army, which is mostly either, if you want to call them, secular, or at the very least non-Islamist in their approach to create a democratic Syria, which is more reflective of the demographics, which of course would then mean with a majority Sunni population, they would be dominant within the government. But then you also have two other forces that are there. You have one force which looks at this as an opportunity to wage a kind of jihad against not only the al-Assad family, but what they see as a kind of Arab secularism there. And this turns out to be Jabhat al-Nusra, and Jabhat al-Nusra is essentially the Al-Qaeda movement within Syria. There are some within Jabhat al-Nusra who feel as though their tactics and their methods are too mild and moderate, and they then go ahead and splinter off to form what is known as the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, or what is also known as Daesh. So this then becomes the group of the opposition that are there. Now the problem when it came to fighting against Assad is that there were external forces that were also there. You had, for example, the United States, you had Turkey, you had various Gulf states, all of whom saw that Assad was a liability, he should be removed. The reason was, for some, was that Assad was a conduit. He was an ally to Iran, he was an ally to Hezbollah within Lebanon, and there was an effort, particularly by Sunni states, to break Iran's influence within this region, going from the Persian Gulf all the way to the Mediterranean. The challenge was that while everybody might have been opposed to Assad, their priorities for why differed. For example, for the United States, it was, we need to do something about ISIS. Well, Turkey was also involved and wanted to see Assad go, but for them, ISIS was not the primary threat. It was the Kurds. The Kurds in the north of Syria could join with the Kurds in eastern Turkey to form what they had hoped to form, which was an independent state. Much of that would be at the expense of Turkish sovereign soil. So Turkey wanted to see Assad go, but they did not want to see that with the strength of the Kurds, who were, by the way, supported by the United States because the Kurds were fighting against ISIS. When it came to the Gulf states, whether it was Qatar or the United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia or Bahrain, they wanted to see Assad go because they wanted to see Iran's influence reduced in the region. The problem, though, is that they did not want to see a more secular, democratic regime in Damascus because it would make them look badly. The Gulf states always tried to assert themselves as being the only stable Islamic option in the region, which means that you have a monarchy, which means that you have a dictatorship. But if there was a true Muslim democracy within the Arab world, they were then afraid that this would spread and it would even threaten their regimes as well. So there was always this imbalance when it came to how to fight Assad and to remove him from power. What we find, though, in the aftermath is at least 500,000 killed and 6 million people who were displaced, at least externally. 3 million to Turkey, 1 million to Lebanon, 850,000 to Jordan, and the rest that were scattered to North America and to other parts of Europe. And that does not include at least 40% of the population of Syria internally displaced. So a very chaotic situation that was there. So if you take a look at this map, then you can see the various forces that were involved within the Arab Spring. It's luckily color-coded because it shows you who's backing whom. So I'm going to help you because I know Wasim is sitting there squinting his eyes. So you've got the GCC, which is the Gulf states. They're supporting the Free Syrian Army, but only partially. In many ways, they are also, some of them, supporting Jabhat al-Nusra indirectly. You have the United States, which is supporting the Syrian Democratic Forces, whom Turkey is not very fond because the SDF has a very large Kurdish contingent in there. You have Russia and Iran and Hezbollah, of course, supporting the Assad regime as well. So really, it's a dog's breakfast of groups that are really not full alliances moving forward, and in many ways they're also not very well coordinated. So here you see the priorities. For the US, it's stopping ISIS. For Turkey, it's stopping the Kurds. For the Gulf states, it's stopping democratic Islam. The other side, of course, has a lot more in common. Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah all want to save Assad. So here we see then Syria after the civil war, and in many ways it's split up into areas or zones of influence depending on who the major control group is there. In the north, not surprisingly, you have the SNA, the Syrian National Army, which is backed by Turkey. You have areas like the yellow areas, which is the SDF. This is the Kurdish US-backed force over there. And then you see in the red, Syria, the country's army, with the help of Russia in particular, has a stronghold over there. Russia gets involved in backing Syria primarily because it has a naval base on the Mediterranean in a town called Tartus. Well, this is important for two reasons. One, because it is Russia's main and really only naval base in the Mediterranean to allow its ships to refuel and get serviced without having to go back through the Turkish Straits back to Crimea, where they have their naval fleet in the Black Sea. And the other reason why this is important is because Tartus is in Latakia, which is the Alawite stronghold. So it's important to see then the relationship between the Assad family, where the Assad family draws its power in Latakia, and that is also where the Russian base is. So again, a little bit confusing. But there is another group that forms also that was initially part of Al-Qaeda or Jabhat al-Nusra, and this is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, and this is the group that you probably are hearing about quite a bit today. And here you see that they have this little area in northwestern Syria around the town of Idlib. So they then break off in 2016 from Jabhat al-Nusra, saying we're kind of done with them. They don't seem to be very successful either. We're going to then go ahead and have our own identity moving forward. And so for many years, we thought that the Syrian civil war had pretty much ended, that Assad had won. The United States had pretty much withdrawn its interest or its forces from there. The Trump administration in particular really seemed to be risk averse to have any presence within the Middle East, at least militarily. It seems like either it's because he gave it to Russia because of his affinity with Putin, or just simply because he felt that the United States doesn't need to be involved in Syria. And for that reason, and for many other reasons, it really fell off the radar for the general American population, certainly within the Muslim community of America, and particularly for Syrians. They were monitoring this very closely. But again, there did not seem to be any indication of what was going to happen over the last few weeks. Well, that changes dramatically. So who's involved now in the revolution? Well, we have the SDF, again, the Kurdish militia supported by the United States. They are actually also very close to a group that the Turks have named as a terrorist organization. This is the PKK, which is the main Kurdish opposition within Turkey. Turkey opposes them, but they also accuse them of various war crimes, committing ethnic cleansing, forced displacement, and also using child soldiers. You also have, as I mentioned, HTS, which is Hayat Tahrir al-Shams, formerly part of Jabhat al-Nusra, but now they have claimed that they have disavowed themselves over the last 8 years. They're led by a man named Ahmed al-Sharah, also known as Abu Muhammad al-Jalani. And then you have the Turkish-backed group, which is the Free Syrian Army or the Syrian Arab Armed Forces. They're fighting against the SDF. So here you have Turkey, which is a NATO country, the US, which is a NATO country. The US is backing the Kurds because the Kurdish group is fighting against ISIS. The Turks don't like the Kurds, and they're not really concerned about ISIS. And so it's creating then a little bit of friction among them. And then you have, of course, the Syrian National Army, which is the forces of the government. So all of this actually starts around Thanksgiving time, on the American calendar. Full coincidence. There is an increase in the opposition, and this is actually spearheaded by HTS itself. There had been a lot of skirmishes and a lot of fighting that had been going on now, but it seemed as though by and large it had been contained. What was happening, though, is in the opposition groups and the areas that were backed by Turkey, you started to see advances. Along with that, you also found Syrian army forces starting to retreat. And the more that Assad's forces started to retreat, the more emboldened the opposition forces began to assume their role. And you see particularly in areas not only of Idlib, but elsewhere within Aleppo province, in a short amount of time, the opposition forces become very successful, in fact taking 15 different towns in the process. So what we find then is the government responds with a certain amount of attacks, airstrikes, and shelling, including by Russian forces, because not only does Russia have a naval base there, they also have an air force base in nearby Latakia. Well, the very next day, the opposition forces reach Idlib and the government troops retreat fully. So this then becomes a kind of a domino effect. And I would actually suggest that even the opposition forces were probably caught off guard by how quickly they were advancing and moving forward. Within the next day, they reached the city of Aleppo, which is the largest city in Syria, and they had been expelled from there for the last 8 years. The very next day, they take control of Aleppo, so within 24 hours, and they also seize control over the international airport. Hama province, which is to the south, also has a goal and a victory of 4 more cities that are taken. So if you take a look here, within about 4 days, they have made significant strides with no real resistance from the government forces. But I think it's also important to realize, and I think this was something that Assad was noticing, was that he really did not have much backup support from Russia or from Iran, which he would have perhaps gone ahead and expected. Well, of course, it would have been naive for the opposition forces to think that Assad was simply going to allow this to happen. And on December 1st, there is a counterattack both in Idlib as well as in Aleppo. Now, Iran assures Assad that it will support the counterattack, but when push comes to shove, Assad receives very little support from Tehran. Tehran was actually also at this time under quite a few airstrikes from mostly either Israel or also from the United States, or at least US coordinated airstrikes against Iran. Russia is now also in a quagmire because if you remember, right before Thanksgiving, the United States had started to not only provide more military support to Ukraine, but also given Ukraine the green light to use those weapons against Russia proper. So with this escalation over there, Russia now has to move away from any kind of support it can give to Syria and really focus on what is become an escalation or a surge in its situation with Ukraine, so no real aid there. So in many ways, Assad is left flat-footed and without any kind of support. Within 6 days, Homs is taken by the opposition. And the United Nations decides they need to go ahead and at least urge some kind of negotiation talks and invites all parties to Geneva, none of whom go. Right before that, we find that the opposition has also started to move toward Hama and reaches Hama within 6 miles. Now, this is, of course, really significant because it comes 42 years after the very brutal clampdown by the Assad regime, in that case, Hafez Al-Assad, on Hama, as much as 50,000 people who have been killed. So what happens is you find that there is a symbolic nature to these areas being recaptured by the opposition. That provides even greater motivation, it provides greater encouragement, it provides greater incentive. On December the 5th, the opposition takes Hama. And on December the 6th, they move on the city of Homs. Now, while all this is going on, in Doha, Qatar, there is the Doha Policy Forum, where there are leaders that come from all around the world, and it's actually an amazing few days. 2 years ago, I was in Doha for it. I wasn't able to make it this year. But this year, it just so happened that the foreign ministers of Iran and Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Russia and Turkey all happened to be there, and so they had a meeting on the side of the Doha Policy Forum to discuss Syria. And one of the things that we can go ahead and assume came out of it was that Russia and Iran said, we're staying out of this. That then was a bigger signal to Turkey to say that we're going to invest more into HTS and the opposition, because this was a way for them to go ahead and secure the removal of Assad, or at least pressure on Assad and pressure also on the Kurdish population as well. Now, the end game comes on December the 8th, when even Syrian state media reports that Assad has been overthrown. And there was a lot of confusion on December the 8th. There were people who were tracking by some of these flight app programs that Assad had actually taken a flight out of Syria and that he was heading to the United Arab Emirates. Others said that his flight actually took off and crashed somewhere near Aleppo. That proved, of course, not to be true. The first report was also proven not to be true. In fact, what had happened was he had reached a safe area under Russian protection, an Air Force base, but when the Russian Air Force base was threatened by the opposition, the Russians decided to evacuate not only him, but other forces, and he ended up in Moscow. Now, the Assad family has had a very strong and sustained relationship with Russia. In fact, the Assad family owns 18 luxury condos in one of Moscow's tallest buildings. Bashar al-Assad's son is in fact a PhD student at Moscow State University, so the whole family is in fact ensconced over there. Assad made a statement a few days ago in which he claimed that he had no desire to leave Syria, that he was going to stay there until the very end, but that he left on the urging of and the pressure of Moscow. Again, these are all face-saving statements that are made. When the news comes that Assad has left, when Damascus has fallen to HTS, the opposition then sets free the prisoners from all of the various Syrian jails. And of course, many of you know the images of people who had been tortured, some who had been in prison since being children. One person was interviewed as having no idea what year it was, in fact also thought that Saddam Hussein was still in power in Iraq. So it just shows you the depth of what was going on there. Well, Abu Muhammad al-Jalani, one of the first things he does is he goes to the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, a very symbolic gesture, prays there and declares that Syria has now been liberated and is now an Islamic nation. His other statement then is also very important for both the domestic consumption in Syria but also the world stage. He says that the Syrian government is ready to extend its hand, he reports that the Syrian government has approached him and has said that it will extend its hand to the opposition to ensure a smooth transition of power. So this means essentially that Assad's government that was left behind no longer has the stomach to go ahead and oppose or resist, and that they're willing to try at least to avoid any bloodshed to cooperate. I think what's interesting is what has happened since then. In many ways, Jalani himself has had a kind of a makeover in the West. Jalani was a member of Jabhat al-Nusra. He separated himself in 2016 from Jabhat al-Nusra because of a difference of opinion. But as far as the United States was concerned, both he and the HTS were terrorist organizations. There was a $10 million bounty on his head. Within that span of time, between December 8th and December 19th, Jalani gave an interview on CNN. He was referred to by his real name, Ahmed al-Sharah. CNN also placed his preferred pronouns underneath, he and him, which was very strange. And it showed that there was an outreach to Jalani, that he was perhaps not the pariah that people thought that he was. Over the last few days, U.S. State Department officials traveled to Damascus. They met with Jalani himself, and in fact they issued very public and official statements saying that Jalani has given very positive messages, including the promises to ensure that quote-unquote terrorist groups cannot pose a threat. Well, this has now led to the de-escalation and the de-designation of Jalani and HTS as being terrorist organizations. The State Department and the Biden administration are now removing the $10 million bounty on his head, and they are declassifying HTS as a terrorist organization, meaning that as the government of Syria is now moving forward in the post-Assad era, is being defined more and more as being the HTS government, the United States is showing that it wants to cooperate with it, recognize it, legitimize it, normalize it, and by doing so, it is also reclassifying. So here is Ahmed al-Sharah al-Jalani. He fought against the U.S. In Iraq when he was in al-Qaeda there. He fought in Syria as part of Jabhat al-Nusra, but then he cut ties with al-Qaeda in 2016, or Jabhat al-Nusra, and he formed Hayat al-Tahrir al-Shams. Today, the breaking news is that two countries have reopened their embassies in Damascus. One country is Qatar, and the other country is Turkey. And in fact, there was a photograph in today's news of the Turkish foreign minister sitting with al-Jalani. And al-Jilani was no longer dressed in military fatigues or camouflage. He was dressed in a very nice suit. So Jilani has now made a transition from being a designated terrorist to a freedom fighter to a statesman, all within the span of about 1 month. So then who are the winners and who are the losers in this revolution? Well, I think clearly the Syrian opposition has won. They were able to succeed in their primary goal of removing al-Assad. The next group, I would say, is the Syrian diaspora, and particularly those who are displaced. There seems to be reporting that many want to return to Syria because they see a prospect of being repatriated. It's interesting that they want to do so even before the country has either really restabilized or the areas that they had to flee have been rebuilt, because of course there was so much destruction during the civil war. But by far the biggest winner in the revolution, at least regionally, that's not Syrian, is Turkey. They came in, they backed the right side, and they also were successful in pushing back the support or the gains that were made by the Kurds. As far as who would be seen as losers in the revolution right now, I think Russia certainly has to be seen in many ways as having lost particularly its influence of having a client within and in Damascus in the form of al-Assad. Iran has probably suffered even worse than that. Its regional influence has now been really completely destroyed. Syria provided a very nice conduit for it to provide weapons and support to Hezbollah in Lebanon. That is no longer going to happen with someone like Jilani there. And Hezbollah itself has lost that pipeline that it enjoyed with Assad in power. But I would say that the Gulf states, particularly the UAE, have also lost in this, because there was an effort that was being made, particularly by the UAE, to try to bring Assad on side. They were courting him with financial support and other measures to try to have him escape the Iranian orbit and appeal to his Arabness, as opposed to Iran being Persian, to come back in with pledges from the Arab League as well as from the Gulf Cooperation Council. And they were unsuccessful. Not only is Assad gone, but the power that really came into the region and into Syria now is Turkey, not them. And that is a very interesting rivalry. As far as some of the others for whom I think the jury is still out as to whether this was a victory or a defeat, the United States. The United States was backing, of course, SDF, and SDF was really proven to be ineffective in removing Assad, and so their hope for having a Kurdish patron there in some capacity is no longer there. The other issue is, of course, with a new incoming president like Trump, who doesn't quite understand the situation, it seems. He's also said that this really isn't our fight, so he doesn't really want to get involved in it, which is really code for he doesn't really understand what are the implications. Despite the PR that Netanyahu came in right after Damascus fell and said, you know, basically we're going to take credit for this with the pressure that we were putting in the airstrikes on Syria, and taking out Hezbollah and neutralizing Iran, trying to claim victory, that might not be so sure. Assad actually was not a bad figure for Israel. He maintained the status quo. And in fact, reporting out of Great Britain shows that Assad, on his way out, in order to try to save his own skin, gave Netanyahu the intel about where all of Syria's military assets were to allow Israel to then go ahead and strike them, including taking out Syria's naval forces in the Mediterranean and other key missile and weapons caches. There was one that exploded outside Damascus. So this was, of course, his last treachery, and I think even those who backed Assad and thought that he cared about the Syrian people, it shows that he was going to do anything to save his own hide and his own political power. Jordan is, I think, another country where the jury is still out about whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. Jordan was hostile toward the opposition, but Jordan is a country that, because it's really stuck in the middle, has a lot of difficulty with maneuvering which side of any issue to be on. I think the Kurds also are uncertain about their future. It's very unlikely that HTS will go after the Kurds. I think that the Kurds are going to try to negotiate with Damascus to maintain what kind of semi-autonomy they have in their region. And it's quite likely that HTS will grant that to them. In the same way that I would argue that HTS and Russia are probably going to negotiate. Russia will probably tell Jolani, if you allow us to maintain our naval base in Latakia, all is good between us. And really there's no reason for Jolani to go ahead and reject that request. The other question is about ethnic and religious minority communities, whether it is the Christian community, the Druze community, or others. And this is a kind of a mixed bag. I mean, on the one hand, we've heard that Jolani has made statements saying that they have nothing to fear, that there will be freedom of worship. Even the Masjid of Bibi Zainab, the people were allowed to worship there without any kind of issues. There hasn't been any full-scale retribution against those who are seen as backing Assad. But again, it's still very early within the process. What would I look out for as we move forward? Well, we have to see what the government is going to be like. Right now, it seems as though al-Jilani is in power. I thought the two appointments that just happened were very, very interesting. One is who is named as the foreign minister, which is Assad Hassan al-Shabani, and then the defense minister, who is Murhad Abu Khasra. Both of them are strong supporters and allies of Jilani, but they're also seen as moderate individuals. The biggest issue facing Syria, of course, is its financial profile, so it'll be interesting to see who comes in to provide financial support and aid for the country. Another thing to go ahead and consider is what's going to be Syria's foreign policy. How far are they going to lean into Turkey? Turkey is clearly going to want to have some return on investment for what they have provided for them, but who else can go ahead and line up to form alliances, and who wants to go ahead and do that? Whether there's going to be a retribution or reconciliation. After decades of brutality by the Assad regime, there's going to be some case on the part of the Sunni population to say something needs to be done. I doubt there's going to be a Truth and Reconciliation Committee or Commission as there was in South Africa, but it'll be interesting to see. I think at the very least, if some of the leadership can be held accountable, that might go a long way to show that there was some kind of justice that was served. And again, how the treatment is going to be toward the ethnic and the religious minority communities, particularly because that's going to be weaponized by external forces, especially in the West, who for whatever reason are looking at, if you read the news reports, especially on social media, claiming that basically Al-Qaeda is now running Syria, which really doesn't seem to be the case. Who are going to be the potential allies with the regime in Damascus has yet to be seen, and who are going to be the potential adversaries of Syria also. It's still too early to go ahead and tell. Well, I wanted to end on this. This is the former Syrian flag, which was there until December the 8th. The red in the flag on top was actually something that the Ba'ath Party had as part of their flag, both in the 1960s and during the time of Hafez Al-Assad moving forward. And the new flag of Syria is actually this one, with the green, which was the part of the original Syrian Republic, and one that HTS wants to show has been removed of the Ba'ath Party influence and the influence of al-Assad. So inshallah, I will take any questions that you have. Jazakallah khair. Yes? Yeah, they've actually kind of gone back and forth on the number of stars that are there. Now remember, the original star of Syria was drawn up by Lord Percy Sykes of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, who really loved drawing the flags, and so he used the same color schemes of red, white, black, and green. And the flag, although it has gone through some changes, the only things that change are really the number of stars and the colors of the bars. Yes? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay. Okay. Yep. Yeah. Okay. Sure. So two excellent questions. So the first one is about the Alawite population, or the Alawis. The Alawis are actually quite a minority sect from Ithna Ashari or Jafari or Twelver Shiism. They do not believe in the imamate, as does Jafari Shiism. In fact, Alawite belief is that the wahi should have gone, na'uzubillah, to not the Prophet ﷺ, but should have gone to Hazrat Ali radiallahu anhu. So that's, of course, a major difference. And what's interesting, and I hope that you appreciate this, is that despite the fact that Iran is a Jafari or a Twelver Shi'i country, that theological difference wasn't one that was a deal breaker for them. This was really a geopolitical issue, that the doctrinal differences didn't really matter as much to them. On the second question, yes, Israel launched an immediate attack to take territory well beyond the Golan Heights into other areas approaching even the southern city of Daraa. This is a fairly common practice by the Israelis. They claim that they're doing this in self-defense. They are doing this, of course, also to change the facts on the ground. The argument is that this is going to be a negotiation and a bargaining chip. There really does not seem to be any basis in international law that would justify that. But then again, Israel's interpretation of and adherence to international law has seemed to be a little bit sketchy, to say the least. So we'll see what happens. It'll also be very interesting to see whether there's going to be any pressure from the Trump administration to persuade Netanyahu to pull back his troops. There is really no strategic interest in Israel holding on to that territory other than strictly a land grab. Yep, yep. Yeah. Okay. Sure, thank you for that. So the first question is, do we know much about Jilani himself before that? I'm not sure. And I'm not sure it really matters, because as far as the West is concerned, the starting point of Jilani was the fact that he was in Al-Qaeda in 2003. And I think more importantly than that, that doesn't even seem to really concern them anymore. There has been an almost 180-degree restoration of Jilani in official Washington circles. The fact that this is an individual who now seems to be, at least by this administration, completely legitimized, and one with whom they're working so closely, I think is really fascinating. And I think for that reason has probably caused more than a few to look at it through conspiracy, thinking, is this happening because there's some grand plan that's going on? And I would argue that that's probably a little bit naive, because it's really the Turks who are calling the shots on this. Erdogan clearly is the bandmaster in this. The other question regarding whether Turkey is moving into the Kurdish regions, I don't think so. They're certainly pushing back on the SDF, but I don't think that they're going to come into northern Syria. I think it'll probably be more likely that they will back Syrian forces to then engage with SDF up there. Yes? I'm sorry, you had what? Yeah. Yeah. No, no, no. As far as the retraction of the declassification of HTS as a terrorist organization and the removal of the $10 million bounty, that's coming from the U.S. government. Yes, yes, yeah. That's been verified that they've done that. Yes. Yep. Yeah. Again, the reason I put it as unsure is because it's too premature. I think it's interesting that Ahmed al-Sharaz's other name is Abu Muhammad al-Jolani. I mean, al-Jolani, the Golan. I mean, he's not from the Golan Heights, but he's actually representing himself and mentioning the Golan Heights in there. There's a certain amount of signaling that's going on there, and I think that the Israelis are responding to that possibility. Jolani is an unknown commodity right now. They understood Assad because he had been in power since 2000. They understood his father, who had been in power for 30 years beyond that. So somebody that they had understood, or a regime that they had understood for 54 years, that's no longer there. And so now they were going to have to recalibrate and reassess what the relationship is. Yeah. Well, I think, at the heart of your question is something that then becomes complicated, and that is looking at this through the lens of theology and looking at this lens through geopolitics. I am not a theologian, so I'm not going to comment on the theological elements of this, and I'm certainly not going to then go ahead and judge who is and who is a murtad or not a good Muslim. Wallahu alam on that. The uncertainty about how Israel is looking at this is again through the lens of international relations and what kind of expectations it has as a adversarial neighbor to a country like Syria. If all of a sudden there's a regime change there, it's going to cause them to have to reassess everything. Does it mean that Hezbollah has now been neutralized? Well, that was an argument that Israel was making before the fall of Assad. Have they neutralized Iran? Well, that was an argument that they were making before the fall of Assad. So that might be just simply immaterial to looking at this. But again, now that you have, after 54 years, having to question whether a new regime might have a different posture toward Israel, is going to cause Israel to spend more time thinking about this than they had before. Yep. Yeah. They have control over the vast majority of the country. They have control over the major commercial centers of the country. And so that is something that upon which they're going to build. And it'll be interesting to see if the SDF backs off. Because remember, the SDF was also interested in getting rid of Assad. So Will this then lead to some kind of a negotiation between Jolani and SDF? Again, we're still very, very early on in the process. Yeah.
According to Google, Assad might have taken about approximately $250 million. That amount looks pretty normal, or it could be more than that, or
250 million?
yeah.
No, I think you're off by a magnitude of 8. I think he's taken $2 billion. No, 2 billion. Yeah. That's I think the conservative estimate that he's got.
He's transferring money right from 2018.
Yeah.
All planning.
Well, I think if you are the leader of Syria and you've just gone through a lengthy civil war, I think parking your money somewhere else would be something you'd be doing anyways. I don't think it was necessarily that he was anticipating what happened. I don't think anybody was. This happened so quickly. And this is, again, I think, drawing a few of the more conspiratorial or maybe even strategic thinkers saying that, was this part of an incremental increase to go ahead and put pressure and to distract Russia? And by doing so, Syria then would be in play. Was the push and the pressure on Iran enough to then make Syria the weak link in the chain? And that's something that we still have to analyze. Yeah, Janae? Oh, the sanctions on Syria? Oh, absolutely. I mean, I would expect that the sanctions that are imposed on Syria are going to be lifted. The fact that you have the restoration of diplomatic relations by countries like Turkey and Qatar, the money will start pouring in now. Yeah, absolutely. Yep. Will this serve as a domino effect to others? No, no. I mean, if you, who's left? I mean, Lebanon is in shambles right now. I mean, it's so politically fragile, it's economically fragile. If I had to guess if there was, I mean, who's the most vulnerable leader in the Arab world right now? It probably has to be Abdullah in Jordan. Yeah, but I mean, I think that's more posturing. I mean, Sisi is well in place by the United States and also by Gulf states. I mean, he was brought into power by the Gulf states in 2013 with the ouster of Morsi. So, you had a question? Oh, okay.